The human mind has a way of building walls around the truths it cannot face. We tell ourselves stories, small, comforting lies, to make sense of routine, of love, of trust. In the quiet spaces of daily life, we rarely imagine the shadows that may be forming just beyond our awareness. Yet some betrayals do not arrive with warning. They grow silently, patiently, inside the minds of those closest to us. On the surface, Robert Limon's life appeared ordinary, even stable. He was a dedicated railway worker, a husband, a father, and a man who showed up for his shifts on time. He worked at a BNSF railway maintenance shop in Topeka, Kansas, a place defined by schedules, safety protocols, and the hum of machinery that rarely changed from one day to the next. It was the kind of environment where predictability was expected and danger was managed through procedure. But psychology teaches us something unsettling. Routine can be the perfect disguise. When patterns repeat long enough, they stop being questioned. Familiar faces become trusted by default, and when deception hides behind consistency, it can remain invisible until the moment it explodes into reality. On August 17, 2014, that reality arrived without mercy. It was a Sunday, a day that typically moved at a slower pace. Inside the railway maintenance shop, the atmosphere was calm. Workers moved through their tasks with practiced ease, unaware that the final moments of one man's life were quietly unfolding nearby. When Robert Limon was discovered, the scene shattered every assumption of safety the facility represented. He had been shot and left where he worked, a place meant to provide structure and security. At first, the case looked deceptively simple, a workplace killing, a tragic act of violence. Investigators began with the most obvious questions: who had access, who knew the schedule, who could enter without raising suspicion. Yet from the very beginning, something felt wrong. There were no signs of chaos, no struggle that suggested rage or randomness. The crime felt controlled, intentional, personal. As detectives dug deeper, they realized they were not dealing with a crime of impulse. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was something planned, possibly rehearsed, by someone who understood Robert's routines, his movements, and the environment itself. Psychologically, this detail mattered. Crimes committed in familiar spaces often point to intimate knowledge. The killer did not fear being recognized. The killer did not fear being noticed. That kind of confidence does not come from a stranger. It comes from proximity, from blending in, from being exactly where one is expected to be. Robert Limon was known among coworkers as reliable and respectful. He did not carry a reputation for conflict. There were no known disputes that suggested he was in danger. His personal life, from the outside, appeared stable. He was married to Michelle Limon, a woman who worked as a police officer with the Topeka Police Department. To many, their relationship represented trust layered upon trust, a railway worker married to someone sworn to uphold the law. But psychology warns us that appearances are not evidence, they are masks. As investigators began reconstructing Robert's final hours, they noticed something else that did not fit. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen property, no attempt to disguise the act as a robbery. Whoever pulled the trigger had come for one reason and one reason only. Robert Limon was the target. This realization shifted the entire direction of the investigation. Detectives moved away from random theories and began narrowing their focus inward, toward Robert's personal relationships, his marriage, and the hidden emotional landscapes that rarely show themselves in public. What they would uncover was not just a motive, but a psychological unraveling that had been years in the making. Behind closed doors, beneath uniforms and titles, secrets had been festering, lines had been crossed, boundaries ignored, and within that secret world, loyalty had been replaced by obsession. The case would soon reveal how authority can become camouflage, how desire can override reason, and how the human mind, when driven by fear of exposure, can justify the unthinkable. This was not merely the story of a man who lost his life at work. It was the story of how betrayal evolves, how double lives collide, and how the darkest crimes are often born not from hatred, but from desperation. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect on this. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? If you're watching Dark Psyche Case Files and you're drawn to the psychological depths behind real crimes, don't forget to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel and stay connected to more cases where the human mind reveals its darkest corners. By the time investigators secured the BNSF railway maintenance shop, the sense of shock had already spread beyond the building's walls. Word traveled fast through Topeka, Kansas. A railway worker had been killed while on duty, inside a controlled facility, in a place designed to prevent accidents, not invite violence. For detectives, the setting itself was the first psychological clue. Crimes that occur in highly regulated environments rarely happen by chance. From the outset, law enforcement approached the case methodically. They documented the scene, reviewed work schedules, and compiled a list of every employee who had access to the shop that day. Sundays were quieter, which narrowed the pool even further. Fewer people meant fewer variables, and fewer places for a killer to hide. Yet as investigators reconstructed Robert Limon's final hours, they noticed something unsettling. There was no indication of panic or surprise in the surrounding environment. Nothing suggested a confrontation that escalated out of control. Instead, the scene reflected precision. Whoever committed the act knew exactly when and where Robert would be. This was not a crime driven by rage in the moment. It was shaped by anticipation. Psychologically, this distinction mattered. Planned violence often signals emotional investment. It suggests that the perpetrator had time to justify their actions internally, to rehearse the outcome, and to convince themselves that what they were about to do was necessary. This kind of mental preparation does not happen overnight. It develops slowly, reinforced by secrecy and rationalization. As detectives expanded their focus beyond the workplace, they turned to Robert's personal life. His marriage quickly became a point of interest, not because of public conflict, but because of its unique dynamic. Michelle Limon was not just his wife. She was a sworn police officer with the Topeka Police Department. To investigators, this presented both reassurance and concern. On one hand, law enforcement families often understand the pressures of duty and responsibility. On the other, proximity to authority can create blind spots. When someone wears a badge, trust often follows automatically. Michelle Limon appeared composed when questioned. She cooperated fully, offering timelines, background information, and emotional responses that, on the surface, aligned with grief. She described Robert as a devoted husband and father, a man with no known enemies. There was nothing in her initial statements that directly raised alarm. But psychology teaches us to listen not only to what is said, but to what is avoided. As interviews continued, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Small details did not always align perfectly, nothing dramatic, nothing overtly suspicious, just enough to make seasoned investigators take a second look. Patterns matter in behavioral analysis, and even minor deviations can point toward deeper truths. At the same time, detectives uncovered information that reframed the case entirely. Robert Limon had been aware of something deeply personal, something he was not supposed to know. Evidence revealed that Michelle had been involved in a secret relationship outside the marriage. The affair was not casual, and it was not recent. It involved a fellow law enforcement officer, someone who understood procedures, surveillance, and how to operate within systems without drawing attention. This revelation introduced a dangerous psychological triangle: betrayal, exposure, and fear. Affairs often remain hidden because secrecy fuels them. But when secrecy is threatened, when the truth risks coming into the open, the emotional stakes change dramatically. Shame, panic, and the instinct for self-preservation can override moral boundaries. especially when reputations, careers, and identities are at risk. Investigators learned that Robert had discovered the affair and had confronted Michelle. The marriage was no longer operating under illusion. Trust had fractured, and with that fracture came uncertainty about divorce, custody, public exposure, and professional consequences. For someone whose identity was built around authority and control, this loss of narrative could feel unbearable. As the investigation deepened, detectives began examining communication records, calls, messages, patterns of contact. Slowly, a timeline emerged, one that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Robert's death was not an isolated act, but the endpoint of a long psychological process involving more than one person. This was no longer just a homicide investigation. It was a study in manipulation, in loyalty distorted by desire, in how power can be weaponized when fear takes hold. Behind uniforms and sworn oaths, lines had been crossed long before a life was taken. And as detectives closed in on the truth, the question shifted from who had the means to something far more unsettling: who believed they had no other choice. If you're following Dark Psyche Case Files and you're drawn to the hidden motivations behind real crimes, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps bring these complex stories to light, stories that remind us how fragile the boundary is between order and chaos. By the time investigators reached this stage of the case, the narrative had fully shifted. What began as a shocking workplace homicide was now unfolding as something far more intimate and calculated. The focus was no longer solely on where Robert Limon died, but on the emotional and psychological forces that had been circling him long before that August morning. At the center of those forces was the secret relationship investigators were now carefully untangling. The affair was not impulsive. It was sustained, hidden, and deeply entangled with professional familiarity. Michelle Limon's relationship with another police officer had developed over time, shaped by shared shifts, shared stress, and the unspoken understanding that comes from wearing the same uniform. In psychological terms, this kind of bond can accelerate intimacy. When two people operate within the same high-responsibility environment, emotional boundaries often blur. What made this affair especially volatile was Robert's awareness of it. Evidence showed that Robert had discovered the relationship and that confrontation had already occurred. This was not a suspicion quietly buried. It was a truth that had surfaced, changing the power dynamics inside the marriage. From that moment on, secrecy was no longer protective, it was threatened. Psychologically, exposure is one of the most powerful stressors a person can experience, especially when their identity is tied to public trust. For a law enforcement officer, reputation is not just personal, it is professional. Allegations alone can dismantle careers. Confirmed misconduct can end them permanently. Investigators began to ask difficult questions. What did Robert intend to do with what he knew? Had he considered divorce? Had he spoken to anyone else? Was he planning to expose the affair formally? Even the possibility of these outcomes would have been enough to create panic. And panic, when paired with perceived loss of control, can lead individuals to rationalize actions they would otherwise reject. As detectives examined communications more closely, they identified a troubling pattern. The frequency and timing of contact between Michelle and her secret partner suggested urgency. Conversations intensified around the same period Robert confronted his wife. This correlation was impossible to ignore. In behavioral analysis, escalation often signals crisis. When people feel cornered, they seek reassurance, validation, and solutions, sometimes from the very person who helped create the problem. The affair partner was not an outsider. He was trained in law enforcement tactics. He understood investigations, response times, and how crime scenes were processed. This knowledge introduced a chilling possibility that planning had occurred under the illusion of confidence. Investigators did not rush this conclusion. They moved carefully, knowing the weight of the implications. Accusing members of law enforcement requires evidence that is not just convincing, but airtight. Every step was documented, every assumption challenged. Meanwhile, Michelle Limon continued to present herself as cooperative. She maintained composure, answered questions, and adhered to procedure. But beneath that surface, detectives observed something subtle, an emotional restraint that felt more controlled than overwhelmed. Psychologically, grief presents differently for everyone. There is no single correct response, but investigators are trained to notice when emotional expression appears regulated rather than raw, particularly in cases involving personal loss. As pressure increased, so did scrutiny. Financial records were reviewed, movement patterns were analyzed, alibis were checked and rechecked. Slowly, the walls that secrecy had built began to crack. What investigators found suggested not only motive, but coordination, actions aligned toward a single outcome. This was no longer a story of infidelity alone. It was a story of fear turning into resolve, of authority becoming a shield, and of how rational thinking can erode when a person believes their entire world is about to collapse. Robert Limon had trusted the people closest to him. He had believed that truth, once revealed, would lead to accountability or resolution. What he could not have anticipated was how that truth would be perceived, not as a problem to face, but as a threat to eliminate. And as investigators closed in, one reality became increasingly clear. Robert's death was not the beginning of the story. It was the final step in a plan already set in motion. If you're watching Dark Psyche Case Files and you're drawn to the psychological unraveling behind real criminal cases, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your engagement helps keep these stories told with care, depth, and respect. By the time investigators began narrowing their focus, the emotional gravity of the case had intensified. What they were uncovering was no longer circumstantial, it was structural. The pieces were aligning in a way that suggested intent, coordination, and a shared understanding of consequences. At the center of that structure was the affair partner, fellow Topeka police officer Christopher Bumgarner. To investigators, Bumgarner represented a critical psychological variable. He was not just emotionally involved, he was professionally equipped. His training, experience, and access meant that if a crime were to be planned, it would not resemble disorder. It would resemble procedure. Evidence showed that Bumgarner had been deeply invested in the relationship with Michelle Limon. This was not a hidden fling destined to fade. It was emotionally charged, sustained, and reinforced by secrecy. In psychological terms, secrecy can act as glue. The more effort required to hide something, the more valuable it begins to feel. But secrecy had failed. Robert Limon's discovery of the affair changed everything. What once felt controllable now felt exposed. The future became unpredictable, and unpredictability is often the trigger that pushes people toward extreme decisions. Investigators revisited timelines with new clarity. On the day of Robert's death, movements aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. Access points were known, schedules were predictable, and the maintenance shop itself, a secure, familiar environment, had become the perfect location for a crime that relied on invisibility rather than force. What troubled investigators most was how ordinary everything appeared on the surface. Michelle reported for duty as expected. Bumgarner followed routine patterns. Nothing outwardly signaled crisis. Yet psychologically, this kind of normalcy can be intentional. When individuals believe they are executing a plan, they often cling to routine as camouflage. Detectives also examined weapon access. The firearm used in the killing raised immediate concern due to its professional nature. Law enforcement weapons are traceable, accounted for, and monitored. Any deviation from protocol creates risk. That risk, however, is often underestimated by those who believe they understand the system well enough to avoid scrutiny. As interviews progressed, pressure mounted. Michelle Limon was questioned again, this time with more direct focus. Investigators asked about her relationship with Bumgarner, about conversations that took place after Robert discovered the affair, and about discussions involving fear, exposure, or solutions. Her responses remained controlled, but the emotional distance became harder to ignore. In psychological profiling, emotional containment can suggest rehearsal. When answers appear too consistent, too measured, it may indicate preparation rather than reflection. Meanwhile, Bumgarner's behavior drew its own attention. Subtle changes in demeanor, statements that required clarification, timelines that needed adjustment. Nothing overt, but enough to raise flags. Investigators understood that when two people share a secret under stress, cracks often appear where stories must align. Eventually, the investigation reached a turning point. Detectives confronted the reality that Robert Limon's death could not have occurred without insider knowledge. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of access, and access narrowed the field dramatically. As evidence mounted, the psychological narrative became unavoidable. This was not about love alone. It was about fear of consequences, about control slipping away, about two individuals convincing themselves that removing one person could preserve everything else. But crimes built on rationalization rarely account for aftermath. Because no matter how carefully a plan is constructed, the human mind cannot anticipate guilt, pressure, and the weight of sustained deception. Over time, those forces erode even the most confident facade. And for Michelle Limon and Christopher Bumgarner, that erosion had already begun. What investigators would uncover next would transform suspicion into certainty and turn a hidden betrayal into a national headline. If you're watching Dark Psyche Case Files and following this case with us, don't forget to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support allows these stories to be told with the seriousness and depth they demand. Thank you. Here is the final chapter, written with the same psychological depth, documentary tone, and monetization-safe approach. The final stage of the investigation unfolded slowly, deliberately. By this point, detectives were no longer searching for answers. They were building a case. The emotional atmosphere surrounding Robert Limon's death had shifted from confusion to clarity. What once appeared as a senseless workplace tragedy was now exposed as something far more calculated, a convergence of fear, secrecy, and decision-making that could not be undone. As law enforcement compiled their findings, the evidence against Michelle Limon and Christopher Bumgarner became impossible to ignore. Digital records revealed patterns of communication that intensified after Robert confronted his wife about the affair. Messages showed urgency, reassurance, and emotional dependence. The timing alone was telling. Investigators concluded that the affair had reached a breaking point, and that both individuals had begun viewing Robert not simply as a husband, but as a threat to their future. This was the psychological core of the case. When people believe they are about to lose everything, their careers, their reputations, their identities, they sometimes begin to view morality as negotiable. Fear becomes justification, and justification becomes action. In the months that followed the killing, investigators continued working quietly. They understood that this case required precision. Accusing law enforcement officers of orchestrating a murder demands proof that leaves no room for doubt. Eventually, that proof was assembled. Michelle Limon was arrested and charged in connection with her husband's death. Christopher Bumgarner was also taken into custody, accused of being directly involved in the act itself. The shockwaves from their arrests traveled far beyond Topeka. A police officer, sworn to protect, accused of helping plan a murder. Another officer accused of carrying it out. The psychological betrayal extended beyond Robert Limon's family. It reached the community, the department, and every person who believed in the integrity of the system. During the trial, prosecutors presented a case built on motive, communication, and coordination. The affair was no longer speculation, it was fact. The fear of exposure was no longer theory, it was documented. And the plan to remove Robert Limon from the equation was no longer hidden, it was reconstructed piece by piece. In the end, the jury delivered its verdicts. Michelle Limon was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Christopher Bumgarner was found guilty of carrying out the killing. Both were sentenced to life in prison. But no verdict could restore what had been taken. Robert Limon was more than a name in a case file. He was a father, a son, a co-worker, a man who trusted the people closest to him to tell the truth, even when the truth was painful. Instead, he became the victim of a decision made in fear. The psychology of this case lingers long after the courtroom doors close. It reminds us that betrayal does not always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from those who share our home, our secrets, our lives. And it reminds us of something even more unsettling. The most dangerous lies are the ones told to ourselves. If you've been watching Dark Psyche Case Files and found this case compelling, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us continue exploring the psychological depths behind real-life crimes, with respect for the victims and clarity for the truth. Thank you for staying with this story.